Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We have returning guest Jordan, and we like Jordan, so we're going to help him out with another repair. Jordan wants to replace the bushings in his upper control arm. So just like we showed in part 2 in the lower control arm bushing video series, we're going to utilize our Harbor Freight 20-ton press with the bearing splitter, and we're going to press those bushings out and then use the press to press the new bushings in. For the upper control arm bushings, there are aftermarket choices, but from what I've seen, there isn't anything that I've heard that is a better choice than OEM. For the lower control arm bushings, white line is a pretty good choice, and a lot of people have gone that route, including myself. But for the upper control arms, I would suggest going OEM, and that's what Jordan did. So this is an OEM upper control arm bushing. All the bushings are exactly the same. There's not different part numbers for the forward bushing or the rear bushing. They're all the same part number. And here's the part number right here. 48632-35080. To get ready for this job, we have the front end of the vehicle jacked up. We have it supported on each frame rail with a 6-ton jack stand. And we have the wheels chalked so the vehicle can't move. Let's get going. The first thing we're going to do is we're just going to get this upper part of the mud flap out of the way, because we're going to be pulling out the long bolt, and just for ease of access, folding this thing down out of our way is going to make it easier for us. So there's 2 plastic clips up here, and Jordan's just going to take a little special pry tool. It's got a forked end, and he's going to get in between the fender well and the clip and pry it out. So now that's folded up out of the way, and it gives us a better view of the bolt head. Next thing Jordan's going to do is going to remove the cotter pin of the castle nut. He's just using a needle nose pliers. If you live in rusty areas, you might find that that cotter pin is rusted in, so it might be a fight. For Jordan, it looks like it's coming out no problem. Now we're going to zip out this 19mm castle nut. Jordan's going to use my little Dewalt impact. We'll see if it can take it off. No problem. Okay, now to break free the upper ball joint from the upper control arm, we're going to utilize a long arm puller. So this is the long arm puller that we're going to use. This is part of a kit that I bought from OTC, and I'll put a link in the video description, so if you would like to buy the same kit, you can purchase it. So Jordan's going to capture the edges of the upper control arm in that fashion. One arm near the spring and the other arm facing directly out towards the tire. For this particular puller, it needs a 16mm socket or open end wrench or box end wrench to turn it. So he's just getting on there with a big 1/2-inch drive ratchet, 16mm socket. Just putting pressure on the top of that spindle till it gives. Just like so. Now that the knuckle is free, you don't want it just to be pulling on the brake lines. We're going to support this somehow to where it's not pulling tension on the brake line. Jordan's just going to use a short piece of baling wire and support the knuckle by tying it to the spring.
Point the pointy edges away from you.
The next thing that we have to do is we got to get the long bolt out that holds the upper control arm to the frame. So Jordan's just going to lubricate the end of the threads with a little WD-40 because it's kind of dirty. And that nut for the long bolt is a 19mm, so Jordan just getting on it with a big long 19mm box end wrench. There we go. You saw it took tension off and it just flopped down. So the nut is spinning the whole thing, so I'm actually putting a 19mm box end on the bolt head so Jordan can get the nut off.
There we go.
The next thing we have to do is we got to slide that bolt out, but there's things in the engine bay against the fender well that are going to stop the bolt from coming out. So now we're going to go into the engine bay and show you what I'm talking about. I'm pointing at the head of the long bolt right here. Right in front of it is the AC line, and the AC line attaches to the fender well forward Right below this electrical connector, there's a plastic clip. So we have to pull the line out of the plastic clip to give the bolt a path to come out. So Jordan, with his hands, pull on that AC line and pull it out of the clip. One thing to note, that this is an airbag sensor, so be careful when you're jostling that AC line right near it, because you wouldn't want your airbags being deployed. And then further back on the fender well, there was another clip that Jordan released, and now the line has a lot of play to where we can get that bolt slid out now. Now that the AC line is out of our way, Jordan can now start sliding that bolt through. This might happen to you, so the bolt head is dragging on the fender, so we're just going to take a pry bar and do a little bit of manipulation to bend that one little side of the fender out of the way. So from up above, I have a big pry bar in between the head of the bolt and the fender, and I'm just prying out a little bit to give a little more room.
Let's see if that's good now, Tim. There we go. Now we're free.
It didn't take much, and now the head of the bolt is clear of the fender. So what Jordan is doing is he's got the shaft of the bolt in the hand, and he keeps on pushing the washer back so he can continue to get the bolt out, because if the washer hits the fender, then everything stops. And it's such a long bolt that it comes all the way back and actually hits the radiator or the AC lines right at the front of the vehicle. So now with the bolt out, this thing could just pull right out, like so. So it's totally up to you. If your bolt looks like it's in good shape and it's not all rusty, I suggest just letting it lay right in the engine bay, because there's no real need to take it out, because you're just going to be putting it back in anyways. Just like in part 2 of the lower control arm bushing replacement video, in order to use a hydraulic press to do the bushing removal, we have to get a bearing splitter in between the sleeve of the bushing and the control arm. The purpose of the bearing splitter is it's going to support the arm while we're pressing out the bushing. To get the bearing splitter in place, we're going to bend the flange of this bushing out a little bit. So what Jordan's going to do is he's going to take a chisel with a hammer, and he's going to hammer this flange outward. We're going to get one side of the bearing splitter on this side of the arm, and then we're going to get the other side of the bearing splitter on this side. You just have to bend it out on this edge and then on the opposing edge on the other side. We now have the sleeve of the bushing bent out enough to where the blade of the bearing splitter can get a good bite on the sleeve of the control arm. You just do the same with the other side. You bend down the flange of the bushing sleeve to where you can get the bearing splitter in. When you get near this side right here, this part of the control arm kind of gets in the way of the bigger chisel. So if you use a tool like this, like a big long punch, a heavy duty punch, you can get in there a little easier than the chisel. The next thing you do is you get the bearing splitter on both sides of the bushing, and then you tighten these nuts to where the blades of the bearing splitter get in position to where it's going to be supporting the arm. You don't want to crank on the nuts too tight to where the blades actually start firmly grabbing the actual bushing itself. You just have to snug it up pretty good, but don't crank on it with all your might. Now we got to bring this over to the press and get the bushing out. Just like in part 2 of the lower control arm bushing replacement video, we're gonna use the same technique of putting a big press sleeve on the top to give the bushing somewhere to go, and then we need something on the bottom to drive the bushing out with. And I found out that a 27mm impact socket captures the bushing really well, but it's still small enough that it doesn't get stuck in the arm of the control arm. So that's gonna be on the bottom. So right now we have a little pressure being applied by the 20-ton press. We've got the adapter that comes with the press sleeve kit, and I'll put a link in the video description to the press sleeve kit I bought off of eBay. Big press sleeve to receive the bushing, big bearing splitter. I'll also put a link in the video description for this bearing splitter from OTC, and a 27mm impact socket. So as we drive force down with the press, the 27mm impact socket is going to start pushing the bushing through the arm and into the upper sleeve. I usually use heat, but I'm going to try it without heat and just see how it goes. It looked like the arm was getting a little crooked, so we stopped and reset. If you find that when you're pressing and you're starting to load up the press and nothing's happening, I suggest you reset and try again. This is our second attempt here.
Ah, yeah. Okay, excellent.
All right, we finally got movement.
Good. Didn't really even take that much force. And it's a nice steady push.
We use no heat on the end of the arm to make it easier. This is just pure force from the hydraulic press getting this bushing out.
There we go.
And there it goes, it's free.
Now look at that.
And there's the bushing. Let's take a look at the arm. Did we do any damage to the arm?
We've got a slight indentation on the sleeve here.
So it wasn't biting us quite as far as we thought.
No, it wasn't quite as far as we wanted. Take a note, next time we'll bend the flange back further.
Yeah, we'll have to bend the flange back a little bit further so we can get the bearing splitter in a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
This is what the opposing arm looks like after we got done with the pressing. By bending out the sleeve of the bushing a little bit further and getting a better bite with the jaws of the bearing splitter, we didn't do really any damage to the arm, which is what we wanted. We also learned if you use a press sleeve that sits in this concave section of the bearing splitter, it wants to walk on you and move a little bit. So this time we chose a press sleeve that's really wide that actually sits on the flat parts of the bearing splitter. This way it was a more firmer platform and it didn't want to move on us. Now that we have both bushings out of the control arm, Jordan is using some emery cloth and he's just cleaning up the inner diameter, getting any rust out of there, any dirt, debris, so it's ready to receive the new bushing. Here's something to note. This is actually the driver's side control arm. You'll notice that the sleeve of the bushing isn't bottomed out on the actual control arm, and so when we do the press work, we have to be mindful of that we don't want to bury the bushing all the way in. We want to leave what it looks like about 2 millimeters, and this is important because as the bushing comes through the other side, if it pushes through too far, then it's going to be too tight and we're not going to be able to slide the control arm in place. We're going to press the bushings in with about 2 millimeters of space between the sleeve of the bushing and the control arm, and then we're going to test fit and see how well it fits. If it needs a little more adjustment, then we'll press in a little bit further. But better to start off with the sleeve of the bushing further out than too far in. We're ready to press the new bushings in. The way we have it set up, first of all, we had to lower the cross member of my Harbor Freight press. When we started the job, we were on the second hole. Now we're down to the third hole. We have one of the press sleeve adapters on the bottom supporting a sleeve that supports the arm, but the inner diameter of this sleeve is big enough for the bushing to be able to go through a little bit. On top, we're going to put the new bushing in, and it fits in quite a ways before it actually starts getting tight. Now we have to grab another press sleeve that's going to capture this sleeve of the bushing. So we don't want to actually be putting pressure on the rubber. We just want to be putting pressure on this metal outer sleeve. It's going to go wider than the rubber part of the bushing. Now we're going to get another adapter plate on the top, and then we're going to center it underneath the press. One thing that I have done with bushings is I've put anti-seize or maybe some grease. We're thinking that it's optional. You don't necessarily have to do it. If you want to, put some anti-seize on there, put some multi-purpose grease, whatever you want. We're going dry on this one. We have a little bit of pressure being applied, holding everything together. As a last check, just make sure everything's square. The bottom sleeve is square with the control arm. The upper sleeve is square with the bushing. Everything's in line, and now we're ready to start pressing. Now remember, we don't want to bottom out this sleeve of the bushing, so we're going to stop at right around 2 millimeters of gap between the sleeve of the bushing and the control arm. I have a ruler that's working as a good feeler gauge to let us know when we're right at about 2 millimeters. Stop right there, I think.
Yep, we're there.
So we're right at about a 2 millimeter gap, and we're gonna call that good and do the other side. So you'll see that we still have a gap between the sleeve of the bushing and the control arm. That's basically perfect right there. We're probably gonna find that once we get the control arm in, it's gonna fit nicely.
So as we test fit the upper control arm where we've left about 2 millimeters of gap, we're seeing, contrary to our expectations, there's some gap here. So really the bushings do need to be driven in further. So this caused us to say, okay, what's going on? If the bushings were pressed in like this before, how come there wasn't a gap when we pulled it out? So let's go back to the bench and look at the bushings and compare them. We're trying to understand why we press these to apparently the same spot, but now have a gap when we install it onto the sleeve on the frame. So when we look at the two bushings, here's a new one and here's one of the old ones that came out. We compare, the outer sleeves are the same distance. We can measure the inner sleeves. We're wondering maybe the inner sleeves are longer for some reason. 52.6 and change, 52.6. So they're the same. But upon inspection, what we notice is that looking at the old ones, the inner sleeve is actually pushed out with respect to the outer sleeve a little bit more. If you compare these two, you can see the difference. Can you see the difference there? So my theory is that Toyota installed the bushings like this for some reason. They're, not pressed in all the way. That perhaps helps them with assembly or something, or tolerances from truck to truck, frame to frame. When this goes on there and gets installed, as the bolt tightens, it pushes the inner collars inward, and then it lives like that its whole life, and so the rubber actually creeps that way. The rubber has basically crept, making it appear like this is where it always was. So what we're going to do is press these in further, because I would like these rubber bushings to be at a neutral position, not pushed in or pushed out when they're bolted onto the frame.
I concur.
So we ended up pressing one side all the way till it bottomed, and then we test fitted it and realized that if we bottomed this one out, we would actually have gone a little too far. Its happy spot ended up being with just a little bit of gap here, maybe about 1 millimeter. At this point, it slides onto that part of the frame with just the tiniest bit of interference. So you'd note that these are not exactly equal. We've got basically 0 gap and about 1 millimeter of gap here. I don't know that that makes any difference. I think the moral of the story here is, as you press these in, don't just assume that both need to be totally bottomed out. Leave yourself a little bit of gap on both sides and test fit it and press it in until it's right where it wants to be.
From experience, getting the upper control arm back on the vehicle is best done with 2 people. One person is in the engine bay pushing the bolt through, while another person at the fender well is holding the control arm square to the frame while the bolt is sliding through. You can do it by yourself. I've actually done it on my 98 4Runner, putting the lift on. I did it all by myself, but it's a lot easier with an extra set of hands. So I'm up in the engine bay. Jordan's got to get the washer on there for me first. So remember that the concave side of the washer faces the bolt head. I'm going to start sliding it through the washer and the one side of the control arm, and then I'm just pushing. Get my hand in there, trying to, kind of hard to film and do this at the same time. Slide it in. It's all the way there. Now Jordan can get the washer and the nut on the other side. Same thing. The concave side faces the nut and the convex side faces the bushing. Now with suspension components, the rule of thumb is you don't tighten anything to spec until you have the weight of the vehicle on the suspension. And the reason for that is, if we tighten up this control arm and loaded the bushings and the arm isn't in its normal travel path, it's not good for the bushing. So once the weight of the vehicle is settled onto the wheels, that's when we torque that upper bolt to its spec. We're not going to mess with tightening that bolt just yet, but we're now going to work on getting the upper ball joint reconnected to the upper control arm. So Jordan just undoing the baling wire we were using to hold the knuckle so it wouldn't put strain on the brake line.
There we go. Okay.
Jordan is now going to torque this to the spec. The spec for the Castle Nut for the upper ball joint is 80 foot-pounds. Now he's going to have to get a cotter pin in there, and it looks like he's going to have to tighten it a little more to get a cotter pin in there. So use your tool of choice. He just has to line up the hole in the Castle Nut so he can get the cotter pin in. So now he has the hole in the spindle of the upper ball joint lined up with the slot in the Castle Nut, and he can get a cotter pin in there. It's always good practice to use a fresh cotter pin. Don't reuse them. And this is pretty much one side done. The final step is just getting the wheel on, getting the weight of the vehicle on the wheels, and then torquing that upper bolt that holds the control arm to the frame to 87 foot-pounds. The driver's side on Jordan's rig causes some additional problems to get the bolt of the upper control arm out. Jordan's vehicle is a 4-cylinder 2.7 liter engine, and it's similar in the respect that you do have to remove a couple things. So number one, there's a bracket here that holds this wiring loom to the fender well. There's a 10 millimeter bolt that holds it to the frame. So we got in there with a small 1/4 inch ratchet and a 10 millimeter socket, and we loosened that. The next thing that's in the way, you can't really see because the battery's in the way. There's another electrical connection that's stopping the bolt from being able to come all the way out. There's a bracket that goes over the top that holds the battery firmly in place in the engine compartment. Jordan already removed that top strap. You have to loosen both of your battery cables, the negative and the positive. It's a 10 millimeter, and then now we can pull the battery out. We want to remove this tray out of the way. Now we have a much better view of what's stopping us. So this electrical connection right here, as we try to slide the bolt out, it's going to come right into this electrical connector. So it looks like all we have to do is take two 10 millimeter bolts out, one here and one here. Off the top of my head, I don't remember this being an issue with the 3.4 liter engine, but it might be. I might be remembering wrong, but I do remember at the very least, we had to undo a bracket that held this wiring loom to the fender. This is the actual bolt hole right here that we took the 10 millimeter bolt out. Jordan's just gonna get on there with a small ratchet and take those out. All right, now we've got free sailing. So we're gonna do the same thing. Jordan's gonna get underneath and he's gonna be holding the upper control arm, and then maybe actually he can get his fingers in there, keeping that washer against the bushing while I'm pulling back on the bolt. It's actually hitting the overflow reservoir. Let's see if I can get that sucker out.
There you go.
There we go.
Good.
So with a little bit of pulling it towards the radiator, I was able to get it out of the way of the overflow reservoir. There's no need to show the press work on the other side because it's the same thing. We're going to use the same techniques. So we're going to get that press work done and then finalize the job. One thing that we didn't note that I'll note now is that on the driver's side, we again had to take this rubber flap off to get access to the bolt easier, but also on the back side there's this hard plastic one that we had to get out of the way too. This is just an additional mud cover. Same thing, get the little tool behind there or a screwdriver and pull free the plastic clips so you can get this up out of your way. We have the battery back in, we have the wiring loom bracket reconnected, we have that electrical connector bracket reconnected, we've got the wheels on, and now we're ready to lower the vehicle to the ground. We're torquing the upper control arm bolt to 87 foot-pounds. It's a little tight to get in there with the tire, but this is the best way to do it. So he's getting about 1 click at a time here.
Let's see, double check them. That I'm on. Yep.
All right, 87 foot-pounds. Now that you got the upper control arm bolts torqued to spec, you want to get your mud flaps back in place. So utilizing the clips, hopefully you didn't break any of them, and you just push them back in. And then on this driver's side, he's got to get the hard plastic one in there too.
There we go.
And it's all done. The final step, and this is one you don't want to forget, is torque your wheel lug nuts. I usually use a torque spec of 85 foot-pounds. Jordan likes to use 80, so we're going to torque the lug nuts. All right, we're done with this job. In typical Timmy the Toolman fashion, you can see there's tools and stuff everywhere after these jobs. We successfully showed you how to replace your upper control arm bushings by utilizing a Harbor Freight 20-ton press with the bearing splitter and with the press sleeve kit. Press work is one of those things that your imagination is the only thing that limits you. There's a lot of ingenious people that come up with ways to MacGyver all different ways to press things out. So if you don't have a 20-ton press and the bearing splitter and the press sleeve kit, I'm sure other people are going to be able to figure out a different way to do this. That's just how Jordan and I chose to do this job. We thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye.